Hello. It's great to see you all here. I've been fortunate enough to attend some of the talks. And I've got to say, I've done a lot of conferences over the years, and y'all are such an engaging and warm audience that it's really an honor to be here. Before I start, something that none of my colleagues have mentioned, which has been weighing on my mind this morning. I was drinking my coffee and getting ready for the day and listening to the news, and I think that it would be really great, and I hope you'll bear with me. I just want to address the Russian tank in the room, if we can. I recently did my genealogy, and I found out that people are always asking me, are you Celtic? Why do you write these stories about Arthur? And actually, at the time my initial DNA results came back, I was not at all Celtic at all. I've always been told that I'm half Russian, Swedish, and Finnish. And then just recently, as more people turn in their samples, they find out more about your actual genetic background. And I got a report back that I'm actually 3% Celtic. So now I'm really an expert. Now you guys can really listen to what I'm talking about today. But I also found out that the 50% of me that is Russian is actually Ukrainian. And so it's cool. So I'm just now starting to, as they're being invaded, learn more about my ancestral heritage there. And I'm wearing tonight the pocket watch that belonged to my grandmother, who was first-generation American. Her family immigrated from Odessa, and my grandfather's family was originally from Kyiv. So both of my ancestral cities are under attack, and they're a sovereign nation. And I think sometimes, especially with everything we've gone through in a global community for the last couple of years, we can feel overwhelmed. And one thing that came to me this morning in thinking about what can we do. Of course, there's lots of organizations you can donate your money to if you have it, but if you don't have money to donate, which I know a lot of Americans don't right now, one thing you can do is you can talk about it. And that's why I wanted to mention it today, and I wanted to address the elephant in the room, because Jennifer Egan mentioned in her talk that once things fade from human memory, and she gave it a pretty generous number of about 100 years it takes for something to fade from human memory, it's gone. And I just want us all to remember that it was only 77 years ago that World War II ended. 77 years, and already people have forgotten about it, and already there's revisionist history out there. So what we can do to be powerful is we can remember, and we can talk about it. So I would just encourage you all, if you feel that that's something you can do, is just talk about the stories you're hearing on the news, share it. And even though that doesn't feel like, we have to be awake to this, and we have to address it, and we have to, as Americans, we've got to stand up and stand behind the Ukrainian people. Okay. All right. So now we can go on a fun adventure. Now I feel better. Okay. So allow me to set the scene. And I'm going to I want to keep y'all interested, so I'm going to walk, but I'm going to wave my pages like a mad professor. 1,400 years ago, a little girl named Languoreth was growing up in a timber hall perched high above the river Avon, in a time before Scotland was even known as Scotland. In the hot days of summer, she would have splashed in the cool river water with her brother and her cousins, setting fish traps and eating blackberries off the vine. Well, bush, technically. Though she was privileged, the daughter of a petty king, squinting in the summer sun, reflecting off that water, Languoreth could never have imagined the life that lay ahead of her. It would be an epic one, full of all the things the best stories are made of: strength and bravery, love and betrayal, passion and happiness, unimaginable loss. She would have had no idea that her brother would go on to inspire one of the most enduring legends of all time. And she would have no idea that she would go on to become one of the most powerful queens of ancient Scotland, who today nobody remembers. We're going to return to Languoreth, I promise. But first I want to switch gears for a moment, and I would love to ask for a show of hands, if I may. I would love to know how many people in this room have ever heard of King Arthur. Oh, wow, okay. So we've got a room here of 250 people approximately, and nearly everyone has heard of a 1,400-year-old legend, which is pretty amazing if you think about it, because it was only when I was growing up that we had this thing called a telephone that was attached to a wall. and it took 25 minutes for it to dial your best friend's number, which you had to memorize. And now we're walking around with these little handheld computers that beam signals into outer space. So this is pretty remarkable that in a room full of this many people have heard of Arthur. But why is that, do you think? Why is it, and what is it about this story that it could have survived all this time into 2022? And of course, the basic story goes, I don't really have to tell you guys, and you all know, Arthur's raised as a foster child. He's your typical underdog. He pulls a sword from a stone and becomes a king. He marries Guinevere, establishes the Knights of the Round Table, and he fights lots of battles, especially against the Saxons. And then there's this old man named Merlin who advises the king, but also he can do magic. I realize I'm not really selling it. That's because while I grew up aware of the Arthurian legend, I was never really that captivated by it. It had all the elements, magic and romance, treachery and heroism, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. It felt hollow to me. It felt as if there was something missing. Ralph Waldo Emerson once wrote that the best fiction reveals the truth that reality often obscures. The best fiction reveals the truth that reality often obscures. As a little girl, I was so enraptured by the stories of Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and Madeleine L'Engle. I suppose I inherently knew this to be true. These were fantastical stories, but they felt so real to me. And I suppose I just couldn't feel any truth in the Arthurian tales, so I dismissed them. And obviously I was in the minority, because throughout time, a human fascination with Arthur and his stories has led to countless recreations. There are actually too many to name, but in writing we have everything from the medieval stories of Geoffrey of Monmouth and Sir Thomas Malory to Marion Zimmer Bradley's The Mists of Avalon and T.H. White's The Once and Future King. And then and there are the film and TV adaptations, everything from the Sword in the Stone cartoon that I watched as a little girl, and Monty Python, to the Merlin TV series. And of course, we can't forget about Guy Ritchie's 2017 masterpiece, King Arthur, Legend of the Sword. Don't get me started. But as different as all these adaptations are, they have one thing in common, and it's that they're all, for the most part, fantastical. It's okay, it's what we expect. It's just a story, it's just a bit of fun. And it's a whimsical and heroic entertainment. That's what I used to think. But what if I were to tell you that within every legend lies a kernel of truth? It's true. In the 16th century, Queen Elizabeth paid £10,000, about the cost of a castle, to purchase a real live unicorn horn. There it was. It was delivered to her. She could hold it in her hands, so she could stick it up on her castle wall. Magic. And it came from a real live animal. Does anyone have any idea what she had paid £10,000 for? Any guesses? A narwhal tusk. But that is a kernel of truth, right? It's a kernel of truth. There was a real animal out there that was being peddled as a unicorn to people far away in Europe who'd never seen one. In 1870, an archaeologist named Heinrich Schliemann dug a trench in northwest Turkey and discovered the ancient city of Troy. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Iliad and the Odyssey, but the city and its location had been written about in multiple texts over thousands of years, but no one had ever bothered to dig for it because they assumed it was all just a myth. And Schliemann found a city that had been inhabited for thousands of years. It had been sacked and rebuilt 13 times, and experts now agree that the settlement he discovered is in fact the city of Troy, and you can go visit it today. This is true, a kernel of truth. That brings us to the Arthurian legend. I like to think of the Arthurian legend as like a 1,400-year-old game of telephone, where the first person stood up and said something like, let's you and I take a walk in the park. And then 1,400 years later, a guy stood up and he's the last guy in line. So it was, let's you and I take a walk in the park. And he stands up and he's like, I got it. Old wizards like to fart. There was an original sentence. It was a kernel of truth, but over time it became so obscured. It became utterly unrecognizable. Luckily, we now know what that original sentence really was, and that's what I'm here to talk about today. It's what I spend most of my time talking about, is this new scholarship. And thanks to the work of multiple scholars, the sentence can actually be boiled down to one word, and it's a name, and that name is Languoreth. She is our kernel of truth. I first came across Languoreth in a little bookshop in Glastonbury, England. I was there publicizing my first book, Faery Tale, which was a travel memoir about rediscovering a sense of enchantment in life. And it did have something to do with finding kernels of truth in myth and legend. And I was browsing the shelves, and I came across a nonfiction book entitled Finding Merlin. In it, a Scottish author, Adam Ardrey, claimed that there was a real historical Arthur, and of equal importance, a real historical Merlin. And that neither of these men lived the sorts of lives that anyone had supposed. And aside from that, they didn't live in England, like so many seem to believe. They lived in Scotland, and they lived 100 to 200 years later than most people assume. Moreover, he claimed that he could prove it. I stood there transfixed, and I didn't really know why, flipping through the first couple of pages, as we do before we fork over that credit card. And I saw her name, Languoreth. She was a queen who ruled the Britons of Strathclyde, its an ancient kingdom, at a time when Scotland was divided into multiple different kingdoms inhabited by 4 different types of people. This is before it was known as Scotland. You had the Britons, you had the Scots, who were actually from Ireland, you had the Picts, and you had the Angles. So we hear a lot about the Saxons. Well, the Saxons came and they settled the south of England and England. The problem that the Scottish people had to deal with were these pesky Angles coming over into the East Coast. And Adam Ardrey claimed that Languoreth was one of the greatest women in European history, and he also claimed that she was Merlin's sister. It was preposterous. I mean, really, what will they think of next? Somebody's trying to resurrect this boring old legend that I already think is stupid. And I was supposed to be working on a follow-up to my memoir at the time, and I bought the book, if only because I was intrigued and I wanted to see how this author proposed to convince me of such a ridiculous situation. And then I found that I couldn't stop reading it. And I was highlighting, and I was taking notes in the margin, and I became maybe a little bit obsessed. My partner at the time asked me when I was going to stop studying this topic and get back to my memoir. And I was hooked because I felt like this fellow Adam Ardrey was really onto something. I read the book cover to cover, and then I dug up all the sources Adam Ardrey had mentioned, and I studied all of those. And then I searched out all the books that I could find relating to ancient Scotland and ancient Britain and the European continental Celts, who both the Scots and the Britons are descended from. History, archaeology, academic papers, every nonfiction book on Arthur and Merlin still in print. And after combing through all those histories and the epic poetry and the 12th century biographies of saints, I came to the same conclusion. Languoreth of Cadzow was the wife of a historical king, you see. So in fact, her husband, Ruther Hale, is one of the few rulers from my time period that scholars do not question his existence. He is a legitimate historical figure from the 6th century. We know the names of their children that were descended from their union. They're written down and detailed in king's lists. And yes, this woman, Languoreth, was said to have a brother, a twin, and his name was Lailochen. Lailochen was a warrior and a politician and a druid. You get the impression from reading the old texts that he was a bit of a volatile type of figure. In the medieval text, The Life of St. Kentigern, who is today actually the patron saint of Glasgow, You hear a lot about this guy, Lailochen. He was an enemy of Kentigern's, and he was the brother of the queen, who the author states was also known as Myrthin. The term is meant to be dismissive. If you read Geoffrey of Monmouth, that's where you'll find this older and more authentic spelling of the name we now know as Merlin. It's spelled Myrdin, which is pronounced Myrthin in Old Welsh, which is the language that, as Britons, Languoreth and Lailochen and Kentigern would have spoken. And roughly translated, it means madman. I learned the nickname was actually only changed to the more familiar Merlin by Thomas Malory, and that would have been 900 years after Lailochen's death. And the reason that Sir Malory, who was imprisoned in jail by the time he was writing this book, he was a knight, changed it is because he spoke French, and Myrthin sounded way too close for even an imprisoned knight to the word merde in French. So he changed it to Merlin. And of course, we lost that connection to Lailochen that's mentioned in a text. So since the publication of Adam Ardrey's book, a lot of other nonfiction books have been written on the subject. He's not the only one. He wasn't the first person, actually. The first person was Nikolai Tolstoy, a distant relative of Leo Tolstoy's, and he wrote a book in the 1980s about how Lailochen, this wild man, could be the real Merlin. So Adam wasn't the first one, and a lot of people have been writing about it since. But still, no one had told the story of Languoreth. And the more I learned about her life, the more disturbed I became that her story had never been told. She was a pre-Christian woman married to a Christian king during this really turbulent arrival of a new religion in Scotland. Her enemies in the early Christian church slandered her name and labeled her an adulteress in an effort to try to strip her of her power. And she was a queen married to a ruler who fought on the front lines on battle after battle against the Angles in a desperate effort to save the kingdom of Strathclyde from annihilation. But truly one of the most heart-wrenching events Languoreth would have suffered in her lifetime was in the Battle of Arthurian, in which her brother and her husband, although they were friends, fought on opposing sides, and she would lose her eldest son in that battle. And I started to think about what it would be like were that me. How would you feel if your brother had to go to war against your own husband and your son was riding off with them? And there's this old epic poem attributed to Merlin where he writes about the fact, he says, I killed my sister's daughter and her son. And that's a heavy thing to drop. I mean, he's so, that's there in the text. She would have known the famous young man called Arthur. Her brother would live on as infamy as Merlin. And yet, while she lived such a life and experienced such a pivotal moment in history, Languoreth was little more than a ghost. She was a scattering of mentionings in these ancient texts. So to summarize, just so we're all on the same page here, there were real historical figures who inspired the Arthurian legend, and Languoreth was chief among them. That is a tremendous discovery. Why isn't everybody talking about this? Why am I the only one? Yet in all these fascinating nonfiction books, we're going largely unnoticed, except for nerds like me who are reading all of them. And for my part, although I didn't know I'd been longing for it, I'd finally found the heart of the story. To me, it was no longer hollow. As I read and rediscovered the battles and the friendships, the love and the heartbreak, I realized that I finally had discovered the reason the Arthurian legend had lasted for 1,400 years. The only problem was nobody else knew about it. I wanted people to know the real Arthur, the Scottish warlord, who is far more interesting than the cuckolded king. Lailochen, the warrior and the politician, seemingly at turns both impulsive and inspiring, was far more magical than a wizard who can shoot magic from his fingertips. The real men and women of the Arthurian legend fought and bled and loved and failed as much as they won, and they had to make impossible choices. They were heroic in the truest sense of the word. And the fact that they were real, the fact that they had lived, made my very mundane world feel so much more enchanted than any fantastical movie I could watch. Yet their very real lives had been dismissed as fantastical, as flights of fancy. I remembered what Emerson had written about fiction revealing the truth that reality often obscures, and as a former book editor, I knew that the only way to make people feel was to put them inside of the story, like I had felt when I was reading about the Battle of Arthurian, to put them inside Languoreth's skin. So I set aside the memoir, and I decided I was going to tackle historical fiction. So to write The Lost Queen, the first book in the series, I gathered all the historical events that took place in Languoreth and Lalacan's life, and I created one giant, huge timeline with births and deaths and battles and kings, all the information. And then the events my characters lived through was what had to shape my narrative. It's the backbone, and without it, I wouldn't have a story. To understand Languoreth, I have to look at the events she went through and then try to analyze, well, how would you have felt? Because, we change so much over time, but, one thing that really doesn't change is human emotion. Like cavemen felt envy, right? They did. The things that we feel, our emotions, are probably one of the most primitive parts of our DNA. So that doesn't change. So in understanding the scope of those events, I can build the characters based on also their reputations in old texts. For example, Arthur's father was a very powerful king named Aidan mac Gabran, and he was referred to in an old text as Aidan the Wily. So when you put that together with a little-known mention of a violent raid that happened on one of Languoreth's fortresses, you can begin to understand the type of person that you're really dealing with. This man was powerful, and he was unpredictable. After 2 books, the characters now have taken on a life of their own, and they come in and go, and new ones show up on the page who are not historical figures to help support the rest of the text. But the historical underpinnings are everywhere, and the imagination only comes in afterward for me. The really fun part, the part that I probably feel most guilty about, is visiting the sites. So I take myself to Scotland rather a lot. Less since COVID, obviously, but I actually just got to go back in November, which was really amazing. And without these trips, it would be really difficult to write, because I don't know if you guys heard, but I live in Charleston, South Carolina, which is it's a tropical, I sometimes feel like I'm living in Conrad's The Heart of Darkness in there, especially when the gnats come out. It's really the antithesis of what a brooding Scottish winter day would be, and I can go walk outside in nature, and all of the plants and all of the animals and all the trees are wrong. I mean, they're fine trees and plants, but they're wrong. I cannot use them for my work. So, I have to know things like, well, what is the nature of this particular river? Could it have been navigated by boat? In what year or what century might it have been dredged? You don't know how deep things were. What are the native plants surrounding it? Is the terrain rocky, or is it passable by foot? And there were no castles in 6th and 7th century Scotland. The nobles of Scotland lived in wooden-built homes and in circular huts that were built on top of hills surrounded by stone ramparts. They're called hill forts. And a lot of these hill forts in Scotland, what's so magnificent about it is they're still there. You can still go visit them. And then sometimes, nearly always, if it's not there, it's because somebody built a castle on top of it, because these were such strategic points in the landscape. They looked over a river crossing. Back then, rivers were the highways. So if you had control over a river, you had money from taxes, right? And you could control who was coming in and out of your territory. You had to be able to see them so you could tax them, or they give you trade in kind, right? So these sites are still used today. That's where most of the castles are. Oftentimes, if it's an old sacred site I'm looking for, I just look for a place where a really old church has been built, because they built right on top of the pre-Christian site. It's magnificent. Scotland's really special for that, and Ireland too. So from studying the artifacts and the archaeological reconstructions in these local museums, I can see what 6th century life would have been like in that particular place. So going to Scotland to tromp around on the battlefields and investigate the old hill forts is so important for me to be able to bring the locations of my stories to life. Because also, sometimes you just get a feeling from a place. In researching the Forgotten Kingdom, I visited the site where this battle, the Battle of Arthurian, took place. It's located on a private farm now on the Scottish borders, the border of England and Scotland, that's owned by a family called the Armstrong family. And so I was fortunate enough to be able to go and introduce myself to the Armstrong family, and they let me through their cattle gate, and I climbed up this mucky sheep poo-filled hill, grabbing onto this barbed wire fence, between the barbs to try to pull myself up, and I kept slipping and falling in that. But I got to the top of this hill, and I had touched on this battle in Book 1, in The Lost Queen. I get to the top of the hill. I'd never been there. And all of a sudden, I looked out, and I saw there was all these pastures below, and I could just, in my mind's eye, see this swarming army come that vastly outnumbered those men, Lailakin and his men on that hill fort. And there was a feeling that came with that, and it was, I guess I expected I would feel despair, because this was a really tragic battle, and there was a lot of slaughter, mostly on the side of the poor guys who were stuck on that hill fort against this allied army of other Britons. But what I hadn't expected to feel was a sense of honor, and there was anger there too. These men knew they were going to die. They were going to decide how. That was really powerful. There are people who say that landscape retains a memory, and I never really knew what they meant until I visited that site, and now I also am one of those people. So according to legend, I'll give you guys like a bit of a, don't worry, this is not a spoiler, because you probably find this on Wikipedia. Lailakin was one of the few survivors of that battle, according to legend. And folk memory says that he fled into the hills somewhere near the modern-day town of Moffat, which is also kind of in the borders. It's in the upland hills, sort of like the Scottish lowlands. And an old poem in the Merlin cycle details how Lailakin spent 7 years in exile after the Battle of Arthurian, hiding from Rutherk's men who were hunting him, thigh-deep in snow, surviving off of roots and berries and grasses. And so on this trip, I made a point to, as I'm going through these stories chronologically, I'm like, I got to write about Lailakin in exile. So I go to this site, I go to Moffat, and it's weird, you go into a little restaurant, and there's a beer called the Merlin Ale, right? Which obviously you have to order that, you cannot have. It's pretty good, actually. And then I went to the site, and what's interesting about where it's set, Hartfell is the name of the hill. There was, all the nonfiction authors had written about this. Nikolai Tolstoy, who I mentioned earlier, was the first person to set Lailakin at Hartfell. And he said that there's a freshwater spring about halfway up into the mountains where you could get fresh water. It's actually known to be a healing well. I don't know if you're familiar with the healing wells of Britain. They have a lot of them, they're called chalybeate wells. They have an iron property to them. So this was a healing well, so you could drink from it, and it had health-giving properties. And so Nikolai Tolstoy went to see the site himself, and he found this little overhang of rock just before you got to the spring. You hike up the steep trail, and it was like a little overhang, probably big enough for one person in the summer to sleep under with a sleeping bag if it was raining. But I couldn't imagine somebody spending 7 years there because I had been to Scotland in autumn with a puffy coat. And it's cold. And I know they say Highlanders are tough, but this is just impractical. So I visited the site, and I get out of the car, and I have this, I guess, we have OS maps here in Britain. They call them Ordnance Survey maps. So I had this OS map that the guy I was staying with, the innkeeper, had lent me, and it blew up the area. So it was much more detailed than your usual one. And I got out of the car, and it's so majestic at this site. There's horses, and I pet the horses, and I'm like, isn't my job so great? And I'm harassing wildlife all over Great Britain when I go on these trips as well. So I was petting the horses, and then I walk over, and I look at my map, and I look down, and I see this little asterisk that catches my attention. And I look, and it says it's a burnt mound. At the time, I didn't know what a burnt mound was, but it was interesting because I knew at least it was old. Right? These were the little asterisks, or those are my little golden coins. That's what you always look for on those OS maps, is anything with those little weird asterisk-looking things. And so it was a burnt mound, and then near it was what they said was a ruin, like a hut circle. And then I looked at the rest of the map, and actually there were hut circles all over the place throughout this entire valley. There were hut circles, and we don't know when these were dated to, because in Scotland, not everything, in fact, most nothing has been excavated, because they just don't have the resources. And you can go to the restroom and trip over a castle, right? So they don't have the time or the resources to excavate everything. So these hut circles no one cares about. It's a deer farm now, and this guy grazes his horses there, and there happen to be all these hut circles. But I'm thinking this is really interesting, because I'm thinking, if I'm a noble who is used to dining on mead and ale and having people serenade me, where would I rather spend my time while I'm in exile? Under this overhang of rock, or in a nice cozy hut at the bottom of Hartfell, where you can have a hearth and you can have a place to sleep, and also more than one person can be there, because it was said after a while lots of people gathered to where Lalacan was, because he was a very natural leader. And then I went home and I was researching burnt mounds, and it turns out that burnt mounds are what they call in Gaelic, it's called a floch fia. And these are sites that Celtic people used for a multitude of things. What they would do is they would dig a pit and line it with stones, and it was usually built by water, either a burn, a Scottish stream, or a river. And they would build a big bonfire and heat up all of these large rocks. So they were burning hot. And they would fill that pool, that little rectangular basin they made, with water. And then they would take the burning hot rocks and dump them into the water and create a natural outdoor cooking space. Hot water, instantly, like boiling hot water. And archaeologists still can't figure out just how they got these stones that hot, but I had done a sweat lodge one time on vacation in Mexico, and seen the guy who was leading it heat these stones in a fire. So I knew how hot it could really get, because I had to sit in that sweat lodge while some lady got too hot and decided to go jump in the ocean. So they get really warm. And so the other thing they think people use this for was laundry and also bathing, because if you build a wicker structure over one of these sites and you put hot stones in the water, you have, and cover it with skins, the wicker structure, you have like a sauna, right? Or like a steam room, basically. And we know from some of the ancient Greek writers that the Celtic people were among some of the cleanest of the people they called the barbarians. We always wondered, well, how did they keep clean with no running water? They had folach fias all over Ireland and Scotland, and a lot of these were still in use into my time period in the 6th and 7th century. So for some reason, none of the men, no offense men, who wrote all these nonfiction books had noticed this site. And had I not visited in person, I wouldn't have discovered it either. So now in the Forgotten Kingdom, when you read about Lalacan's exile, I can portray it as it really might have been. But for every big research success, there are usually at least 5 to 7 blunders. Like I can't find a hill for it, and I just can't find it. I'm hiking, and I'm looking at the map, and it's usually pelting down rain, and I've got my then 3-year-old son in a pack on my back, and now it's getting dark, and he's crying, and his nose is so cold that I'm pretty sure it's about to fall off, and there's no one to ask for directions, because no one else cares about this old hill fort anyway. And it's just not there. So that happens more often than I'd like. One time, the same innkeeper who lent me the map in the borders, we were talking, and he had a love of history, and actually one of his theories inspired a huge kind of small plot line in the Forgotten Kingdom, which is sort of a historical mystery that runs throughout the book. It's fun, about the second book. So his name was John Hume. And John Hume is an armchair historian who runs this series of wigwams where you can go stay in the Scottish borders. I was staying with him in one of his wigwams, and I was saying to him, he said, "Where are you going next?" And I said, "Well, I'm going up to this loch Skene," because I said, there's a crannog up there. And crannogs are these artificial man-made islands that you find throughout Scotland, usually built on bodies of waters like lochs, lakes, and they were from Bronze Age times, and they would build an artificial island a few paces off to shore, surround it with this timber fence, and there was usually a hut there that could sleep anywhere up to 20 people. They would also bring their cattle in there if they were ever attacked. There would be a bridge that would go from the crannog to the land, and they would bring their cattle, and their cattle would stay in these huts with them in the wintertime, because cattle was their gold. That's how they survived, was cattle. So I had seen a map of Loch Skene, which is where I was setting a scene in the book, and I said, "There's a crannog there. I can see it on the map. I know a crannog when I see one," said no one ever that I talked to. But I was really cocky about it, because I was usually right, and so I was like, I'm going to go investigate this crannog site. And John said, no. He said, I don't think there's a crannog on Loch Skene. He said, there's one on St. Mary's Loch for certain, but not on Loch Skene. I said, yeah, well, no one thinks there is, John. Not yet. And I give him these very knowing eyes. I'm like, it's a crannog, just you wait. Okay, so he goes, yeah, go ahead. I go up and I climb up this really steep trail. The site in the Forgotten Kingdom, if anyone is interested, is the Grey Mare's Tail Waterfall, and there's a huge section of the book set there. So this is where I was, this actual location. It's this beautiful waterfall tumbles down, huge, really high, out of the cliffs, and there's a trail that goes up alongside it. If you follow that trail to the top, where you're surrounded by mountains, I came out of this tiny, narrow trail, and there was wild goats everywhere. It's really magical. And there's this beautiful silver lake, and there are these brooding mountains, and it's starting to get stormy, and it's cold, and I'm the only person there. And then I look over, and I see this boulder with a tree growing on it. It's like the size of this chair, probably. This is not a crannog. No. Those Scots are so polite, aren't they? And sometimes I find it really hard to believe that I've dedicated, what's the last 10 years of my life researching the true history behind a legend that originally I felt so meh about. But I wouldn't change a thing. I just think it's funny how life can whisk you away when you throw your hands up and you sort of obey and you agree to follow the muse. So I hope that you've enjoyed getting a taste of ancient Scotland today, and the people whose lives were so integral to building the character of the country that we have now. If you get a chance to read my books, I hope you'll take time to read my overly extensive author's notes at the end of each book, where I help readers see the intersection between fact and fiction. And I'll tell you way more that you want to know than you want to know about the inner workings behind each book. But more than that, I hope that you remember the story about the unicorn, because that can make for a very entertaining cocktail story. And you can have that one. That's all for me. I'd love to take some questions if you have any. And thank you so much for your time and attention and coming out to hear all the amazing authors we've had here today. We already have a question. Yes?
In your research, have you found anything that corroborates the lady in the lake?
Oh, that's a great question. So she wanted to know in my research, have I found anything that corroborates the Lady in the Lake? It just brings to mind this really funny Monty Python quote that I came across when I was writing the speech that is, strange women lying in lakes distributing swords is no form of government, or something like. I wanted to figure out a way to use that, so thank you. So the Lady of the Lake is based off of a few different characters, some that show up in Mallory and some that show up in Monmouth. And really what she's an archetypal pre-Christian figure is what she is. And we don't see a lot about the Druids. That was what the figures were called before Christianity came. The priests of Celtic society were Druids, and they were lawyers and doctors. They were sort of like, if you think of India, they were like the Brahmin caste of the Celtic world. And then Caesar got interested in all of these other emperors, and they officially, many times, after it took several attempts over many centuries, but they say that the Druids were wiped out. So she is a folk memory of priestesses. And yes, I do have a lot of priestesses in my book, and a character specifically who we're following on Harad, who is Languoreth's daughter. I only knew her name, so her path is my invention to try to show you guys what that pre-Christian world would have looked like from the inside, and we see it from Anharad's journey. That's a great question. Anybody else? Oh, wait. Oh, yes, Carrie.
Where is Cadzow, like in Scotland? Where was
Oh, Cadzow. So Cadzow is the place where I mentioned at the beginning of my talk where Languoreth grows up. And you can go visit it today. It's located at Shaddle Country Park in Hamilton, Scotland, which is now, it's a 17th century hunting lodge was originally there. But before that, it was a castle. And then before that, it was a fortress where we think Languoreth and her brother Lalacan grew up. And it's only about 20 to 30 minutes outside of Glasgow. You can drive there, or you can actually take a train. The train takes you right to the bottom of the driveway if you're willing to do a little walking, and you can walk up, and you can walk through the woods where Languoreth and her brother would have walked. Yeah. Yes?
How many books in the series do you anticipate?
So there are there's a trilogy for Languoreth's life. In writing it, I knew with the scope of time, and it's actually not uncommon. There were people, especially in nobility, who lived into their early 70s in what they call the Dark Ages. The reason the numbers are so skewed is because there were so many infant mortalities that it screws up your length of life rate. But if you made it past a certain age, it actually wasn't, there was like something like 40% of people could live into their 50s, 60s, or 70s. So that's a huge misconception. So she lived to be in her early 70s. Oh gosh, I lost my train of thought. How many books in the series? So I have to cover her whole life, so 3 books. And also now the second book has multiple points of view, so we can meet her brother, Lalacan, and we can meet Anharad and Arthur. And so I knew that, and then luckily found a publisher who was willing to partner on that with me at Simon & Schuster, so that's great. And I've recently just sold a 4th book to them, which is a sort of a prequel, because I've become really interested in the Picts, who I mentioned. They're a really mysterious people who lived on the entire north of the Scottish country. Really powerful ancient people. So the 4th book is coming down the line. Yeah. And there may be more, hopefully. I'm still on this train. I can't stop obsessing. So. This is a question back there? Yes?
Did you ever read Mary Stewart's book?
Oh, so yeah, Mary Stewart was an author who wrote a book, The Crystal Cave. I've heard a lot of my readers have asked me that question. I read The Mists of Avalon by Marion Zimmer Bradley, and that was when I was about 15 or so. And then once I knew I was interested in writing, and then I wasn't interested in, aside from that book, I was not really interested in the Arthurian Legend. So no, I never read those books. And then once I knew I was going to write these books, I did have to put blinders on because I didn't want to be influenced by anything else. Like, everyone's like, you should watch that show Merlin. And I was like, no, no, thank you. It's all wrong. Like, everything, I just can't help it. It's all wrong. So I can't, but I've heard her books are wonderful. And I have not read them, but I heard they're magnificent. And it's just a different telling. Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah, I can't, what am I, oh, yes.
You haven't said it explicitly, but obviously it's hard to find the stories of women and the role they played in history, and how it must be a stumbling block for you whenever you walk. Who was by his side.
Right.
So,
Yes. She's saying that I haven't mentioned it explicitly, but it's difficult to find the stories of women in history, and especially this far back in history. And so what I do with that is you have to look at the men, and you think about the woman beside the man. And then you also, I'm lucky with her in that even though there's just a few mentionings, it's things like, we know she could read and write, so she was highly educated. We know that she probably was not Christian, although her husband was. So then it's going back to drawing those inferences, and you have to make that leap. But it is really difficult. Yeah. There's someone else I missed. We have time for one more. Yes.
I'm interested in all these field trips and the interviews. I mean, it just sounds so fun. Have you maintained an audio file, and do you have like photographs that when you emerge up, do you take?
Yeah, so she asked about, do I have an audio file of the interviews and stuff? And do I have photographs? Yes, I always take a ton of photographs, and I don't know if you guys, which social media sites you're on, but my Instagram site, I had just published a ton of photos from my Scotland trip. I did a reel for every day of the sites that I went to. So yeah, if you follow me on social media, I often have those up and post those, and I post kind of behind the scenes about what books I'm reading and where I'm going. But no, the interviews are kind of all up here, but that is probably the part that I enjoy the most, yeah. All right, well, I think we're out of time, but thank you so much. You've been so wonderful. Really appreciate it.